This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show as together we hear how they are making their world better. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Whether you're listening on a run or going to the gym for a workout, or if you're driving to work or coming home after work, we're so glad you've tuned in today. It's always good to have you part of this journey. Today, I want to start out with a question for you. Do you know the difference between a community foundation and a regular nonprofit 501c3? Or another question, is a community trust the same thing as a community foundation? Or what is the grant-making process when it comes to a community foundation? How does it differ from regular family foundations or regular donors? All these questions and more are discussed and explained by my guest today, Amy Freitag. She is the president of the New York Community Trust. She'll give a bit of the history of the New York Community Trust, which is actually celebrating 100 years of its existence, which is a pretty big marker. And she'll dive into this question about how community trusts work, how you as a nonprofit leader can benefit from that, and how they really seek to collaborate with local connections and nonprofit organizations in order to make the biggest social impact they can. As always, thanks for tuning in. Now on to the show. Well, welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I have Amy Freitag here from the New York Community Trust. Amy, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we were talking right before we went to hit record, I think a lot of my listeners, this is my guess anyway, they may not really know exactly what a trust is, how it is differentiated between other foundations and other places and entities that nonprofits can interact with and collaborate with. So I'm excited to have you share a bit more about that. But let's just dive a little bit into your background and your leadership. Share a little bit about how you became the president of the New York Community Trust and what is the primary mission of the trust?
Awesome. Well, Rob, thanks again for having me here. Just such an opportunity to talk about the New York Community Trust on our 100th anniversary.
Congratulations, 100 years. That's big.
100 years this year, and I'm only the fourth leader in 100 years.
Oh, wow. Oh, that continuity is fantastic.
No stress here. No, but it's just a tremendous institution. It's a great honor. And my journey to this really goes back to growing up in Akron, Ohio, a town that had a wonderful and still has a very effective community foundation, really in the just outside of Cleveland, which is actually home to the first community foundation, the first community trust in a sense. So it was that model that New York City not only replicated, as did Chicago and many other cities, but we actually went to Cleveland, took the president, brought him to New York, and he thrived here for 44 years running the New York Community Trust. So we really are at the sort of the birthplace of the New York of the trust model of community foundations. There are now 900 plus community foundations across the country. So it was quite a movement that started 100 years ago. So grew up in Akron. I went to college in Massachusetts, grad school in Pennsylvania. But I always kept coming back to New York City. I love theater. And of course, if you love theater, New York City is the place to be. And I got through my journey, both in New York City and then into the nonprofit world, I became really interested in the idea of conservation of historic places, conservation of the environment. That was the work I studied in grad school. It took me to Philadelphia to do work, both on the nonprofit side and in the public side. Then came back to New York City, had the honor of working in a nonprofit deeply embedded within the New York City Parks Department and serving in the Bloomberg administration as the deputy commissioner for building parks across the 5 boroughs, which was super cool. But, I've had this sort of pendulum swing back into the nonprofit world throughout my career. And I ended up running a couple nonprofits, including Bette Midler's incredible New York Restoration Project. We helped plant 1 million trees in partnership with Mayor Bloomberg. I love that work. But I was really honored then to ultimately get the chance to run 2 different family foundations. And I learned a lot about philanthropy. And it's something about that crazy sort of mixture of experiences that make, I think, me a good candidate to be in community philanthropy because I've worked in government, I've worked in nonprofits, I've worked on grant making, and all of those things come to bear in community philanthropy. So it's been a really wonderful 2 years. I'm celebrating 2 years today with it this week.
Wow, today.
So
All right. Congrats.
um, so let me just say, when I talk about a community foundation, I always like to say that there are two parts of a mission. We take in and we steward dollars, and we make grants. And it's really that sort of connecting of generous New Yorkers and our highest impact nonprofits that has made the trust such a force for its 100 years. We actually span from Westchester County, north of New York, all the way to the east end of Long Island. Those 8 counties are home to 12.4 million New Yorkers. So it's a huge responsibility, but it's a huge opportunity because we think of New Yorkers as incredibly generous and big-hearted folks that want to do the best we can to make this a welcoming and equitable community. So that's really what the trust does. And I'm happy to say that we just recently sort of rekindled our mission statement about the core of what we do is to engage in effective and innovative philanthropy to make this a more equitable place.
Nice. Excellent. That's a great background and really interesting to see how it started and the role Cleveland had in that. So very interesting information. Okay, then going back to now, what is exactly a community trust for my listeners who don't know what differentiates a community foundation from any other philanthropic organization? Explain that a little bit more. Talk about what it is exactly and how it relates to a regular nonprofit.
Well, as we were saying, I love this question because I think community foundations are one of the most extraordinary things that exist in, many, many, many counties, cities, states across the country, but not everybody knows them. And if we all knew more about them, they could be even more impactful. So let me just say, so whereas a private foundation is generally a large pot of money that originated from the wealth of an individual or a great company. Think of David Rockefeller, think of the Ford Motor Company. And this is one big sort of reservoir of generosity. And then that foundation decides, okay, we're going to spend it on this, and we're going to spend it on that, and we're going to spend it on this. So very different is a community foundation that's actually made up of, in our case, hundreds, actually thousands of individual funds. So I like to think of each one of those individual funds as a patch, and they're stitched together. They're big patches and small patches, and they come together as a sort of crazy quilt of generosity that wraps around this 8-county region. And, what's extraordinary to me is that there are generations of generosity that come to bear at the trust since we've been here for 100 years. We have funds that date back to the 1920s. So someone left us in the will, and then we've been able to make grants every year in their name. And by the grace of really good investment at the New York Community Trust, those funds have grown and grown and become more and more powerful. So it's an extraordinary thing. So we work both with donors like that who left us in their will. We call those our permanent funds. But we also work with something like 1,300 living donors who have donor advised funds with the New York Community Trust. Rob, proud moment here. I'm going to tell you that we are the parent of the Donor Advised Fund in 1931. There are now 2 million donor advised funds across the country, and we hold about 1,300 of those. And so those donors get to make their own donor decisions. They tell us who they want to make a grant to. We're holding those charitable funds, and we make grants at their behest. So the Community Foundation does both things. In our case, we hold donor advised funds, and we help those donors make grants. And then we hold a bunch of permanent funds that allow us to make grants. And I can go into that in more depth if we want to talk about grant making in a bit.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. What makes your grant making process different, say, from other funders? Because nonprofits, right, they're looking for funding from all kinds of different individuals, family foundations, obviously state grants, federal grants, but also community foundations. So what does make that grant making process a bit different with you?
So we'll talk again about two different processes. That donor advised fund side. So let me break it down this way for you. Last year, we made about $200 million in grants. About 150 million, or 3/4 of that, went out from our donor advisors. And I'm going to tell you, we made $1,500 grants and we made $10 million grants for those folks. It really depends. One of the things you love about a community foundation, we literally hold funds that were established by cab drivers and school teachers and Rockefellers and Schiffs. So it takes that broad community that comes together. So we have those significant number. I want to tell you, it's like 10,000 grants a year we make for a donor advisor.
That's a lot.
So that's 3/4 of the grants that go out of the New York Community Trust. And we really, we will work with our donors. We will advise them on if they come to us and say, I want to make great grants around hunger, help us. We have this incredible resource of grant makers who can advise those donor advisors. But some just are going to give every year to their alma mater, and that is fine too. And we're here to support them. Basically, they tell us where they want to make the grant. We do some due diligence to make sure the grant is going to the right organization and the organization is a fully, sort of approved 501c3. And then after that, it's really on the grant making side. Different are the remaining quarter or the $50 million that we gave out last year. And those come from those older bequests, those things, those permanent funds, those wills that mentioned they wanted to do something for New York. They left those funds in trust to us so that we would make grants in their name every year. And we have this incredible group of about a dozen grant makers who are subject matter experts in every topic that happens in this 8 counties. I say we do cats to cancer, climate to culture. We do it all. And we have really fabulous grant makers who are studying those issues on the ground, working closely with that nonprofit community. And then every year we are making about $50 million of grants to address the needs of our community. That makes us very special. Not every community foundation has that depth of historic funds that spin off enough resources that we can make those grants in what we call our competitive program, but it allows us to take what I like to say the long view. And we can stick with an issue for a long time because the donor who left us that money in the 1920s isn't like looking at their watch saying, why haven't you, we can stick with an issue and be dogged. And I love that about us. So can I put this all in a real example? Because I think some of our donor stories are amazing. So if you loved theater in New York City in the 1920s, you were undoubtedly the most excited if you got a ticket to see David Warfield. David Warfield was like the Leonardo DiCaprio of his day in New York City. He was not only the most famous actor here, he was the wealthiest entertainer in the world. And he lived here in New York City. And so David made a lot of money. And then unfortunately, tragically, at the end of David's life, he lost his vision. And he left the lion's share of his estate, millions of dollars in the 1950s, to the New York Community Trust so that we could make grants to people who were facing blindness and vision loss. So fast forward to today, we have made tens of millions of dollars worth of grants in David Warfield's name. We are one of the largest funders of disability in the region. 90% of those funds come from David's funds. And we will be making grants in David's name forever. And it just grows and grows and grows. That's what a community foundation can do. And that's why we are so proud of our grant making.
We'll be right back. Are you ready to revolutionize your advocacy efforts and significantly impact policy change? Discover Quorum and level up your advocacy to better educate more lawmakers. Quorum is the only unified public affairs platform that empowers nonprofits to map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape, all in one place. Explore how Quorum Grassroots helps nonprofits create compelling campaigns in minutes. The result? Your nonprofit doesn't just participate in the advocacy, it drives it. Quorum, where influence meets innovation. You can learn more at quorum.us. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. That's an astounding example. And thanks for sharing that. I think that's, again, a lot of people may be surprised by that, just the sheer amount. And then the fact is you're investing it so well, you can continue to provide that year after year after year. And I think that's super impressive. Love that. And one of the things to kind of segue into is this whole idea of collaboration. I talk a lot on the show about collaboration when it comes to social impact specifically. So give us your take from the trust perspective. How does the New York Community Trust collaborate with nonprofits and other local stakeholders in order to drive social impact?
So I love this question too, because first of all, I will never miss an opportunity to lift up our grant making team who, honestly, what I love about our grant makers is many of them have spent the majority of their career in the field doing the work that we are trying to address. So they come with a real proximity to issues and a proximity to the nonprofit community that I would argue is sort of unrivaled. And they really get close to the work. And why does that matter? Well, I'll tell you when that matters. And I will tell you another story about sort of during COVID, among the sectors that was really, really hard hit was our parks and open space, which, most people thought first about hunger and social services 100%. And we also had our arts organizations go through a tremendous stress. But in a city like New York, where people are living in really close quarters, can you imagine being on lockdown with your small children in your apartment? Where are you going to go? You're going to go to the park, or you're going to go to the community garden, or you're going to go somewhere to get outside. And so, unfortunately, our parks budgets were slashed. And New York City has this great history ever since the restoration of Central Park of having this whole quilt of nonprofit organizations, each of whom have adopted some piece of New York City's beautiful Emerald Empire. But they were at risk of going out of business. They weren't getting a gala. They weren't getting concession revenues. So as a group, that group of environmental grantees who we've worked with for generations organized, got themselves together, and then came to the New York Community Trust and to some of the other trusted funders saying, hey guys, we need your help. What are we going to do? And we worked collaboratively with that group of grantees and brought together a community of donors. And we were able to raise close to $8 million over the next 2 years to just be very targeted on those environmental organizations that were making it safe and comfortable for people to get outside with social distancing. So I think it's that kind of rapport that we have with the grant making community and that kind of rapport that we have with our colleagues in philanthropy in New York, that we can kind of play that sort of convening role, which I think is super powerful.
No, it's a great example. And I love that convening power that you have because you have a big footprint and you can offer a lot of resources to all kinds of different good causes. Okay, so who's new to philanthropy, new to the nonprofit world, and they really want to make a difference or a change in their community, how can they get involved with something like a community trust?
So I think if people knew more about community philanthropy, they would be running to us. But because we're kind of this odd duck, right? So they're not always sure. So why can't I just write a check to somebody? Why do I need a New York Community Trust? Well, I think there's like a few good answers to that. The first is that we hold that grant making expertise, and that's available to our donors. So if you come to the New York Community Trust, we give you proximity to all of our best grant making ideas, and we obviously are excited to engage donors and get them in touch with the nonprofits that we love. So it's for the knowledge, I think, that you come to a community foundation. I think you come to the community foundation because you want to work. You may not have a king's ransom to give, but your $25 next to someone else's $25, what if we could get 100 people to give? Suddenly, that idea of collective impact, we've been doing collective impact since before it was cool, right? We've been doing that for 100 years. But the idea of finding a community of aligned folks, so whether it's in a giving circle, we have a fabulous women's donor collective that have been working together for 25 years. They have such joy working together. They are always out trying to, I love it. They always try to scoop us on the first grant to an early stage organization. They want to be ahead of the New York Community Trust. But that kind of joy and that kind of collective action, I think, is the reason you come to the Community Foundation. sometimes people come to a community foundation because they want to make a grant, but they want to do it anonymously and they want to have the privacy of that. And that is certainly something that some of our donors appreciate. Sometimes donors come to us because they have some really odd estate issue and they have an odd asset, like, or they just have appreciated stock and they want to give that because they don't have cash, but they have appreciated stock. Community foundations are sort of problem solvers. They can help address donors with their challenges, and we can help their dollars go the furthest. The founder of the Cleveland Foundation and the New York Community Trust, we just dug up this fabulous quote. And he's like, why do you need a community foundation? Well, let's see. I can sew my clothes, but I'm not a tailor. So it's the idea that, there are really, really expert people that are available to you that can help you make your dollars go the furthest. And we have great stories. There's a husband and wife that live on the Upper West Side of New York, and they've been making grants for food scarcity and hunger for a long, long time. And then they just started getting frustrated. Like they keep writing the same check, but the problem's only getting worse. And so they picked up the phone and they said, tell us how we can do more. And then we went down this great journey with them on helping them try to identify what were some of the upstream issues that were causing food insecurity. And they started making these really innovative grants, very targeted, smaller organizations trying to keep families from having to end up going to food pantry. And they are so fulfilled and enriched by that experience that they are some of our greatest sort of spokespeople for why a community foundation is a great place to partner.
No, great examples on that. And thank you for giving all those different examples. Now, you already mentioned that this is a big year for the trust. It marks your organization's centennial and 100 years of impact in New York, plus all the impact, like you said, you had around the country, really, when it comes to community trusts. Give us a couple more examples. You've already shared a couple, but give us another example that illustrates the trust's legacy of driving forward collective giving.
Yeah, well, look, your listeners will not be shocked to hear that the fact that we've had something like 200,000 newcomers come to New York City in the past 2 years, kind of an unprecedented flow, even in a city that has really been built by immigrants. Like the Statue of Liberty, that's our brand. But even with that kind of inflow, it's put stress on pretty much every social service that we have, whether it's food pantries or people doing housing and everything. So one way we've been trying to work in a collective model is that we have been for well over a year now convening with every other immigration funder in the city every 2 weeks. And then we got into a conversation with the city, say, what are you guys doing? Where are the gaps? We should not do the city's job and the state's job. They are very good at doing certain things, but there are those pieces that have been forever part of the fabric. I mean, we go back to the settlement houses of the early to mid 20th century, welcoming waves of migrants. Those organizations are still on the front line, helping these migrants come to the city, get into the workforce, get into stable housing, and to thrive. And so we work very collectively as a group of funders. We work collectively with the city and the state to try to understand where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, and of course, just try to constantly listen to our grantees to hear what's going on. So immigration's a big one. Affordability in all its forms, whether it's childcare, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, we make grants and we think deeply on all those subject areas. And what we always try to do, Rob, is that, it is everybody wants to give a glass of water to a thirsty person, food to a hungry person. And we have a ton of donors that are able to do that. But one of the things that a community foundation tries to get to, at least our grant making really tries to get to, are what are the systems that need to shift to get something to be different, right? That we can have a different outcome. And so whether that's reading in our schools, we had a reading system that was leaving 2/3 of Black and brown kids reading under grade level. We worked for a decade with a very specific fund that was through the estate of the great Brooke Astor, one of our great New Yorkers, that allowed us to do research, policy work, some direct service, advocacy. Another superpower of community foundations, we can do policy and advocacy work beyond what private philanthropy can do. And over a decade, we now have a new learning curriculum, not only in New York City, but New York State. So we think about these issues, we push on them. And then the final one I'll say, I mean, look, I could give you a list all day long, but I can never miss the opportunity to talk about climate. And, Manhattan is an island. New York City is a very water facing, and it's an urban heat island. So the fact that climate has a real impact, and as we know, it has a disproportionate impact on the people who are least able to escape or to address the hard living conditions in very hot urban places. So we are thinking not only about that work as the New York Community Trust across the 8 counties that we serve, but we also are in partnership with community foundations across the country and have helped stand up something called the Community Foundation Climate Collaborative that really seeks to try to engage private philanthropy, the government spending on climate, and try to get that all the way to the ground, to those grassroots organizations, those environmental justice groups we have been funding for decades. That's what we're trying to do. So community foundations are thinking globally, we are thinking locally, and we are working nationally.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I have a feeling my listeners probably want to find a little bit more out about the New York Community Trust and find out more about you. So how can they do that? How can they connect with you and learn more about the New York Community Trust?
Well, look, I'm going to tell you, we have just launched a new website, and I'm really proud of it. The team at the Trust has worked so hard on it, and it's really about making what we do visible and accessible and exciting. Look, if you're not having joy in philanthropy, which is, of course, the love of people, then what are we doing, right? This is a joyful act, and we want to engage people in that joyful act. I also think that one of the things that I think is kind of a misnomer, I think the name trust sometimes sounds like a bank. Sounds like I need to be a millionaire. Sounds like I need to be a billionaire to get involved with it. Do you know what? On our big COVID fund, where we got $80 million out within weeks and months of the closure of the city and the state, we had people making gifts of $20. And that is as meaningful to us because it is about collective impact, right? So I think the most important things for people to take away from our conversation today, Rob, is this idea that philanthropy is something everyone can engage in, right? And the Community Foundation is often the lowest barrier, the easiest place to get involved. You can open a donor advised fund for $1,500, and you can, over time, figure out how you want to use your generosity, right? One of my favorite stories was a woman that has been giving with us for decades. And she said, Amy, when I first came to the trust, I didn't have any cash. I only had appreciated stock. And someone was kind enough to get on the phone with me, talk me through it. What does it look like? How do I do it? How do I transfer it? How do I open a fund? And she said, you know what? People really respected me and met me where I was. And now, decades later, my grants back then were in the hundreds of dollars. Now they're in the thousands of dollars. And I feel so welcome and respected at the trust. And I think that's a lot about who we are. It's about finding a home for everybody to give back to the community that they love, which I think is what binds us all.
Well, again, just love your passion, love how you're really looking to find ways to support so many good causes, so many nonprofit organizations. And in the midst of your busy schedule, thanks for taking time out to be on the show and share a bit more about the Community Trust.
Well, you are a lot of fun to talk with, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the Trust today.
Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there.